Australian Tamil Congress, Masion du Tamilulam France, Irish Tamil Forums, National Council of Canadian Tamils, Norwegian Council of Tamilulam, Solidarity Group for Peace and Justice in Sri Lanka, South Africa, and US Tamil Action Group. Before we start, please join us in observing a 2-minute silence to pay our respects to the innocent lives lost in the slaughters against Tamils in July 1983, recalling our heroes who shed their lives during our freedom struggle and our people who were killed in the war. Let's pay them our tributes by observing a 2-minute silence. Thank you. Please turn off your cameras if you wish. Thank you. Black July marks the anti-Tamil program that took place in 1983 in the island of Sri Lanka, where more than 3,000 innocent Tamil men, women, and children were massacred by the Sinhalese mob that were aided and abetted by the Sri Lankan state. They burned, decapitated, looted, raped, and killed innocents of Tamils in a spree of violence orchestrated by the Sri Lankan government in power. More than 25 Tamils were injured, 150,000 left homeless, and around 8,000 Tamil-owned businesses were looted and then burnt down during the attacks in July 1983. Tamil properties were destroyed with the intent of preventing Tamils from accumulating wealth. Tamils had their basic human rights violated on an unspeakable scale, with young Tamil men and women stripped naked in public, doused in kerosene and set alight. Tamil school children were kidnapped, raped, and murdered. In the Sri Lankan capital of Colombo and its suburbs, the mobs armed with electoral rolls supplied by the government authorities went around identifying every house where Tamils lived, dragged out the occupants, and murdered them in broad daylight. Tamils have been subjected to programs from 1958 to 1977, with the attacks escalating in 1983, which saw these massacres take place on a scale 3 times bigger than previously, 3,000 casualties. It marked the beginning of one of history's longest wars. The war was over 25 years long. The root causes began during colonization and escalated when the UK gave the Sinhalese population the power at the end of colonization. This power resulted in a long history of oppression and segregation of Tamils in Sri Lanka, leading to the Sinhala Only Act, which legally discriminated against the Tamils and their language. The name change of the country in 1972 from Ceylon to Sri Lanka has set the foundations of a singular Buddhist state, creating a mono-ethnic, mono-religious, and monolinguistic nation. Black July was not a one-off event, but a continuous cycle and an ongoing cycle of violence that has been carried out by the Sri Lankan state and continues till this day. I will now pass you on to our first speaker, who is Krishandini Sarojakumaran, who is the Executive Director of the National Council of Canadian Tamils. She began her advocacy work as a university student, and for over 10 years, she continues to advocate for justice and a permanent political solution for Ulam Tamils within all levels of the Canadian government, United Nations, and also at international forums. Thank you, Krishantini.
Thank you, Sharmila. Okay, so I'd just like to confirm everyone can see the slides.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Black July 1983. The charge is genocide. 38 years ago, thousands of Tamils were massacred by Sinhala mobs backed by the government and state forces. The anti-Tamil pogroms of 1983 was a time in which many innocent Tamils were slaughtered, lit on fire, beaten, and had their homes and businesses destroyed. The anti-Tamil pogroms of 1983 were not the only ones or the first that had occurred on the island. Anti-Tamil pogroms occurred in 19...
Sorry to interrupt you, Krishantini. I think we're just having some technical errors playing the video. We're just going to start that again for you.
regards to national security. This gave authorities the ability to commit atrocious crimes with no witnesses. The anti-Tamil pogroms began on July 24th. Prior to the events in Colombo, army personnel in Jaffna went on a rampage killing Tamil civilians. The killings continued in Trincomalee, in which the Navy randomly shot Tamil civilians and burnt down Tamil properties. The pogroms lasted about a week. From the night of July 24th, Sinhala mobs began chanting on the streets of Colombo, and murdering and burning buildings began. Mobs armed with weapons like crowbars and knives roamed the streets, attacking and killing Tamils. According to eyewitness reports, mobs were chasing Tamils with knives and setting them on fire. Many women were raped, and innocent Tamils' homes and businesses were destroyed. The rioters started to use voters' registration lists to target Tamils. The access to these lists implies previous organization by the government. Mobs of Sinhala men were looting, attacking, and setting fire to anything with a Tamil connection. From July 24th onwards, the violence continued. The quote from the Daily Telegraph on July 26 provided a gruesome picture of the atrocious crimes being committed against the Tamil people. Motorists were dragged from their cars to be stoned and beaten with sticks. Others were cut down with knives and axes. Mobs of Sinhala youth rampaged through the streets, ransacking homes, shops, and offices, looting them and setting them ablaze as they sought out members of the Tamil minority. A mob attacked a Tamil cyclist riding near Colombo's eye hospital. The cyclist was hauled from his bike, drenched with petrol, and set alight. As he ran screaming down the street, the mob set on him again and hacked him down with jungle knives. As a result of the media censorship, many of the photos of the 1983 pogroms did not come to light until much later. One of the most disturbing photos from the events are that of a young Tamil man, stripped of his clothing and his dignity. The man is surrounded by a group of Sinhala men, with one man raising his leg as if he was ready to kick the Tamil man. You can clearly see from this image the lack of respect for human life and the enjoyment in their faces when torturing this Tamil man. The man was later beaten to death by this Sinhala mob. The next photo on the right shows a Tamil business being looted by the Sinhala mobs, while uniformed police officers stood silently and observed.
Krishantini, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but could
No
you possibly put your screen on full screen, please, so we can see properly? Really sorry.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
Just going to stop sharing for a moment.
Perfect. Thank you.
Can you confirm if it's on full screen?
Yeah, we can see now. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Okay. In addition to the programs, can you still see the full screen? Please confirm.
Yes, we can. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. In addition to the pogroms on the streets, two massacres took place in the Walikada prison. On July 25th, the Walikada prison massacre took place in which 35 Tamil political prisoners were killed in this high security prison. These prisoners were held under Sri Lanka's Prevention of Terrorism Act, in which Tamils were arbitrarily searched and arrested. Many of the prisoners were tortured and beaten. On July 25th, two high-profile Tamil activists, Silvaraja Yogachandran, also known as Kuttimani, and Nataraja Thangadurai, were beaten, tortured, and killed. Their eyes were gouged out and later stabbed to death. 33 additional Tamil prisoners were killed on this day. A quote from a survivor from the Walikada prison massacre. On the 27th of July 1983, at 2:30 p.m., there were shouts around the youth ward, and armed prisoners were scaling over boundary walls and starting to break open gates in the youth ward. Nearly 40 prisoners armed with axes, swords, crowbars, iron pipes, and wooden logs appeared before our cell and started to break the lock. Dr. Rajasundaram walked up to the door and pleaded with them to spare us as we were not involved in any robberies or murders, and as Hindus, we did not believe in violence, and as Buddhists, they should not kill. The door suddenly opened, and Dr. Rajasundaran was dragged out and hit with an iron rod on the head. He fell dead among the crowd. End quote. The remaining Tamil prisoners fought off the murderous prisoners using the four legs of a table for over half an hour until the army inexcusable. Without the support of prison guards, the attacks could not have been carried out so strategically and organized. The violence continues throughout Sri Lanka in Norelia, Kandapulo, Hawelia, and Matala. Many Tamil-owned businesses were burnt down. Tamils began fleeing by bus, train, and boat to the north to escape the Sinhala mobs. On July 27th, a train headed for Jaffna at Fort Railway Station was stopped. The Sinhala mob attacked the Tamil passengers, and some were burnt alive on the train tracks. Many Tamils were forced into refugee camps, and many fled to India and other countries to escape the violence. Prior to the Black July massacre, President J.R. Jayawardene stated in an interview to the Daily Telegraph, "I am not worried about the opinion of the Tamil people. Now we cannot think of them, not about their lives or their opinion. The more you put pressure in the north, the happier the Sinhala people." Elected officials and police officers. He continued to suppress the Tamil people, blaming them for their own suffering, while emphasizing the grievances of the Sinhala people. The participation of government, ministers, police authorities, and the army is evidence of a state-sponsored genocide. The systematic discrimination against and violence against Tamils constitutes a genocide, with approximately 400 to 3,000 Tamils killed in Black July, 18,000 Tamil homes destroyed, 5,000 Tamil businesses destroyed, 150,000 Tamils become refugees, hundreds of thousands of Tamils fled the country, and hundreds of youth joined the liberation movement. In the Convention on the Prevention of and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Article 2 states that any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And this is divided into two elements, the physical element and the mental element. In the physical element of genocide, it includes killing members of a group, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. These are the physical elements of genocide. The mental elements of genocide is the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Proving intent can be done based on evidence that depicts the systematic targeting of atrocities against members of a particular group. As applied to the 1983 Black July Tamil pogroms, killing members of a particular group. During the 1983 anti-Tamil pogrom, Black July, Tamil people were targeted using voters lists and other methods. Survivor stories bring to light the many ways in which the mobs were identifying Tamil people. In fear of being killed, many Tamil people who were fluent in Sinhala attempted to hide their Tamil identity. However, some words were specifically more difficult for Tamil people to pronounce and were used to identify them. The events of Black July in 1983 clearly constituted genocide with the intentional and deliberate act to destroy the Tamil people. The mental element of genocide as applied to Black July. Many of the Tamil political prisoners were forced to perform undignified acts to entertain the guards, and if they refused, they were beaten and tortured. This form of abuse was used to destroy the self-respect and dignity of the Tamil detainees. A survivor of the Walikada prison massacre stated, "Another time, a youth was ordered to crawl through mud and water around the courtyard. Ingenious ways were devised to destroy self-respect and spirit of the detainees." Livelihood and cause grief to the Tamil community. What you can't hide is a genocide. To this day, many Tamils continue to mourn the loss of their loved ones. The trauma from the events has had everlasting impacts on victims and their families. The intergenerational trauma of these events have impacted their kith and kin. With the continued advocacy work and fight for human rights, we will bring the perpetrators of the Tamil genocide to justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Shantini. It was very informative, and it was it was a good explanation of Genocide Convention and speaking about the physical elements and the mental elements, because proving intent is extremely difficult, and I think it's you'd explained that very clearly. So thank you so much. Next up, we have Mr. Iqbal. Mr. Iqbal was educated at the University of Ceylon. He joined the administrative services of Sri Lanka and retired in 1997 after nearly 40 years of services in different positions. Among those positions, he has held those as a secretary of 4 presidential commissions of inquiry in Sri Lanka, 2 of which had been on disappearances of persons. He was also a visiting lecturer at the Sri Lankan Institute of Development Administration, the Institute of Human Rights in Colombo, and the Cooperative Training College in Kandy. After retirement, he served as the consultant at the National Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, the Law of Society Trust of Sri Lanka, and the Asia Foundation in Sri Lanka. And finally, Mr. Iqbal is an advisor to the International Independent Group of Eminent Persons who had been invited to oversee the investigations into serious human rights violations in Sri Lanka. He left Sri Lanka in 2007 and was residing in the Netherlands for about 10 years. We will now play a video from Mr. Iqbal.
Good evening, everybody. Discriminatory measures against the Tamils by successive governments in Sri Lanka continued since independence in 1948. Many Sinhalese politicians in the country used Chauvinism as a means to win votes at elections. Within a few months after being elected, the late Prime Minister S.W.R.D. Bandaranaike passed a law in 1956 replacing English with Sinhala as the official language of the country. That accelerated the discord between the Sinhalese and the Tamils that led to many programs. The programs of 1958, 1977, and 1983 stand out as the most atrocious amongst them. The program of 1958 resulted in a large number of Tamils in the public service who could not work in the Sinhala language to leave the service. The pogroms of the later years resulted in Tamils being killed and their properties being destroyed. Consequently, several had to flee from the country and seek refuge overseas. Though no official inquiries were made into the events that led to the riots of 1958, a book called Emergency 58, written by Tazi Vitati, has documented many of the atrocities that took place. That book, which was printed abroad, was banned in Sri Lanka to prevent the people in the country coming to know how brutal the rioting Sinhalese and the security forces personnel had been towards the Tamils. The clamour for justice for those affected by the pogroms of 1977 led to the appointment of a Presidential Commission of Inquiry known as the Sansoni Commission. The contents of this report has never been released in full. In 1981, the Public Library of Jaffna was burnt down while some key cabinet ministers of the time were in Jaffna. That incident was a prelude to the events of that July of 1983, the memory of which remains deeply embedded in the minds of the Tamils. What happened then tantamounts to a genocide or a holocaust of the Tamils of Sri Lanka. President Jayawardena had made an effort to shift the blame for the program onto the ordinary Sinhalese and the Tamils, but he failed miserably in convincing anyone of that story. His address to the nation of 29th July 1983 confirmed that he had planned the violence and had allowed the riots to continue for a few days without declaring a curfew, as he had wanted the riots to teach the Tamils a lesson. He had stated that the clamour of the Tamils for their rights should have been banned long, long ago. He is reported to have stated to the Daily Telegraph as follows: "I am not worried about the opinion of the Jaffna people. We cannot think of them, their lives, or their opinions. The more the pressure you put on the North, the happier the Sinhala people will be. Really, if I can starve the Tamil people out, the Sinhalese will be happy." This statement of President Jayawardena confirms that he had promoted the program and justifies the call to commemorate annually the events of Black July 1983. Hardly any steps have been taken subsequently to deal with the perpetrators. The commissions that headed by Justice Sarvananda, appointed by President Chandrika Bandaranaike to inquire into the July 83 program, as well as other violence that had taken place in 1981, 82, 83 and 84, had many serious shortcomings in its mandate. Yet, Sarvananda's commission accepted the complicity of the state in the burning of the Jaffna Public Library and the other incidents of violence against the Tamils. However, the glaring omission in the report that the commission is the absence of truth-telling by the perpetrators, the lack of meaningful follow-up, notably the failure to recommend prosecution of the leaders responsible for the 1981 and 83 programs had failed to adequately compensate the victims. In the meantime, the human rights situation in the country continued to deteriorate, and many incidents of grave crime continued to take place in the country during the period of Mahinda Rajapaksa too. To counter such allegations, President Rajapaksa appointed a presidential commission which came to be known as the Udalagama Commission to inquire into incidents of serious human rights violations. By this time, the confidence of the people on commissions of inquiry had faded. To prove that he was serious about the dealings with such violent human rights violations, that this commission was going to do serious investigations, he invited EU to send a team of eminent persons to oversee the work of the Udalagama Commission. The team, known as the International Independent Group of Eminent Persons, arrived in the country in 2006. In response to the President's invitation to oversee the work of that commission, IJEP had to abort their mission within 1 year of their arriving in the country. They left saying that there is an absence of political will and the institutional ability of Sri Lanka to conduct human rights inquiries in accordance with international norms and standards. Subsequent events exacerbated the rift between the communities and escalated it into a conflict. Consequently, the war that ended in 2009 erupted and resulted in hundreds of thousands of civilians being killed and a large number of others disappearing during and after the end of the war. The allegations of human rights violations and war crimes committed during the conflict remain uninquired. The appointment of a commission of inquiry into disappearance of persons known as the Paranagama Commission to inquire into and report on the disappearance of persons during the period of the conflict and the lessons learned and reconciliation commission appointed subsequently did not bear fruit. These commissions had, however, found the provisions of the Prevention of Terrorism Act and the impunity with which the security services personnel behaved during the period to be the main reason for the gross violations of human rights that had taken place. Mr. Ben Emerson, the UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights too, had stressed this in a report in 2017 and urged the need to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act. His findings too confirmed the fact that the PTA had facilitated police brutality and torture even years after the war had ended. The view of IJEP that Sri Lanka does not have either the will nor the desire to promote and protect human rights in the country is applicable to the recommendations of all commissions and that had been appointed by successive governments in Sri Lanka on issues relating to human rights in the circumstances, human rights in the country. In the circumstances, it is no surprise that the police and the security forces acted with utter impunity in their military operations, which resulted in the massacre of civilians during the war that ended in 2009 and the human rights violations that took place then and later on. The panel of experts appointed by the UNHRC after the conclusion of the war had this to say: the conduct of the war represented a grave assault on the entire regime of international law designed to protect individual dignity, during both war and peace. In such a situation, the adoption of a resolution by the European Union Parliament calling for a temporary withdrawal of the concession given to Sri Lanka to have preferential access to European market has given some hope for reform. It is hoped that the worldwide commemoration of Tamils have been conducted every year against the programs such as the Black July of 1983 would strengthen the resolve of many countries to put pressure on the government of Sri Lanka to deal with the issues of the Tamils, complying with the undertakings that have been given repeatedly by successive governments to the effect reforms in the laws relating to human rights in the country. If they fail to do so, there is no hope for a better future for the country. Thank you.
We thank Mr. Iqbal for sending the video to us. It had very insightful accounts of what the commissions actually carried out at the time in 1983, and I think in particular when he talks about the Prevention of Terrorism Act, despite it being stated back then that it's been abused to make unlawful arrests for Tamils, in 2021, the PTA is still being used in Sri Lanka. I will now pass you on to our first guest speaker, Salma Zahid, MP from Canada. Salma Zahid is currently the Liberal Member of Parliament for Scarborough Centre. She has worked as a senior advisor to the Government of Ontario in a number of portfolios. She is currently a member of the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration and the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. Salma Zahid, we're so honored to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarmila. Vanakkam. It's an honor for me to be among you all. But it's with deep sadness and sympathy that I speak to you today on the remembrance of a particularly horrific and sorrowful chapter in Sri Lanka's history. It has been 38 years now since a hate-fueled spate of violence, now known as Black July, had engulfed Sri Lanka. The anti-Tamil program in 1983 resulted in the loss of no less than 3,000 Tamil lives, the destruction of thousands of businesses, and the displacement of more than 150,000 individuals. To those that have lost loved ones, relatives, friends, and colleagues, my heart and prayers are with you and those that you have lost. But I just also want to assure you that you have chosen Canada to be your new home, that we have a government that has vowed to oppose hate, racism, and discrimination in all its forms. The Prime Minister of Canada, Right Honorable Justin Trudeau, today issued a statement on the 38th anniversary of Black July. And he said, we join Tamil Canadians and members of the Tamil community around the world to remember the victims of the horrific events of Black July in Sri Lanka. In July 1983, long-standing tensions and unrest culminated in anti-Tamil programs in Colombo and across Sri Lanka, plunging the country into a 26-year-long armed conflict. The conflict killed tens of thousands of people, forced many into exile, and left lasting wounds in communities across the country. In the months following Black July, and thanks in large part to the advocacy of Tamil Canadians, the Government of Canada introduced a special measures program which helped more than 1,800 Tamils resettle in Canada and safely rebuild their lives here. Today, Tamil Canadians represent one of the largest Tamil diasporas in the world, and they continue to make tremendous contributions to shaping a stronger, more resilient, and more inclusive Canada. So on behalf of Government of Canada, I extend my deepest sympathies to those who suffered and lost loved ones during Black July and the ensuing conflict. The armed conflict ended in 2009, but we must continue to work towards lasting peace and reconciliation for all in the country, an undertaking which requires a meaningful accountability process that has the trust and confidence of all victims. Canada continues to support the efforts of all those working towards these goals. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank all Canadians of Tamil origin for their contributions in making Canada one of the diverse countries in the world. I represent a very diverse, vibrant community, and Tamil community is an amazing community doing an amazing job. And during the last 16 months, they have been the frontline workers. They have been there to make sure that we can get through this pandemic. So big thank you to all of you for contributing towards the socioeconomic fabric of this great country we have all called home. Thank you. Nandrik.
Andrew, thank you so much, Salma. That means a lot. And we hope all the Canadian Tamils continue to work with you so we can achieve meaningful accountability and reconciliation in our homeland. Thank you again. Up next, we have our second guest speaker, the Right Honourable Stephen Timms. Stephen Timms, sorry. Hello.
I'm here.
Hi, Stephen. Oh, sorry, that was my mistake. I was trying to, okay. So Mr. Stephen Timms is our Right Honourable MP for East Ham. Mr. Timms has previously visited the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva with BTF to lobby the foreign ministers for truth, justice and accountability for Tamils through an international independent investigation. And he was going to join us in March last year before the COVID pandemic took place. And, you know, we had to cancel Mr. Timms' visit to Geneva, even though he was willing to come out there during this COVID battle. And Stephen has been a fantastic, long-standing supporter of the Tamil community. Thank you so much for everything you do, Stephen. Over to you.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction and for your welcome and for inviting me to be here. And I just want to start by taking the opportunity to express my condolences to all those who are mourning still losses in those awful events we've been reminded of in 1983. I think it's important as well just to recall that the backdrop to our commemoration this evening is that the situation in Sri Lanka has become even worse since the 2019 election. I noticed what the Sri Lanka campaign said in February, and that's an organisation with Tamil, Muslim and Sinhalese support. They said last February, and I quote, "Respect for the rule of law and human rights has demonstrably diminished. The current government in Sri Lanka has significantly reversed progress on 15 of the 25 commitments under Resolution 30/1, that's the United Nations Human Rights Council resolution, and halted progress on 7 others. The position we see today is that the president controls all the senior judicial appointments. There's a climate of fear. Human rights defenders, victims are watched and harassed. Human rights lawyers are held without charge. Before the election in 2019, I think what was happening was the Sri Lankan government was at least paying lip service to the Human Rights Council resolution, which they co-sponsored with the UK after David Cameron's visit as Prime Minister. And I think the calculation was that if the government of Sri Lanka gave at least lip service to engaging, then the international community would by and large leave them alone. And by and large, they were right. Sri Lanka was not seriously held to account for what had happened. But that has changed, I think, now. There is preparedness now to name guilty individuals. The US rightly has designated the army commander, Shavendra Silva, who led the ground assault on the beaches of Mullawaikal at the end of the Civil War, attacking civilians, hospitals, medical staff, and no-fire zones. I think the UK should do so as well. We in the UK now have an arrangement which enables individuals to be sanctioned when they have been responsible for atrocities of that kind. We should use that mechanism. Kamal Gunaratne, now Defence Secretary, led a February 2009 assault attacking civilian hospitals and food distribution points. He commanded the Joseph Army Camp, which is notorious for torture carried out after the war. The United Nations has named him. The UK should sanction him as well. I very much welcome the new UN Human Rights Council resolution, which has been the culmination of all that work in Geneva over a period of years. I think the evidence gathering in the resolution is crucial to make sure that material is maintained for the crucial international accountability which Sri Lanka has resisted for so long, but which one day must come. And I welcome the commitment to regular reports back to the Human Rights Council on the conditions which prevail in Sri Lanka. The problems in Sri Lanka can't be resolved without this independent international inquiry on what happened at the end of the civil war. And I will continue with colleagues from right across the House of Commons to press the UK government to demand such an inquiry. And that new resolution, agreed earlier this year, needs to be backed by sanctions on individuals, as many people, again, on all sides in Parliament are arguing. I very much hope the UK is going to play its part. And I'd ask that my greetings should be passed on to everybody who's marking today, and I'm grateful for the opportunity of being part of the commemoration this evening. Thank you for inviting me and for the warmth of your welcome.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you so much for your ongoing support for the Tamil community, and we look forward to continue working with you. Up next, we have a victim account from Anton Phillips Chinnarasa. Anton is the human rights activist and founder and president of Centre for War Victims and Human Rights, and he continues to contribute in several ways for justice and freedom for our people. Mr. Anton.
My dear friends, today we remember the events on Black July, where thousands of Tamils massacred, thousands of shops burned down, thousands of houses burned down. It was a horrible, unforgettable massacre of Tamils. On July 25th and 27th of 1983, these events took place. I happened to be at Velikada prison, arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism Act for withholding information, along with the Catholic priest, Father Singarayar, Methodist priest, medical doctors, and journalists and architects. And we were kept in a youth offenders section, and there were other political prisoners, around 65 of them were kept in chapel section of this Velikada prison, which was built in the 18th century by the British. On the 25th, the massacre took place on the chapel section, and 35 of them were killed, including Kuttimani, Thangathurai, Jagan, and many other political prisoners. There were 27 of them left, and they were brought here in our section on the 26th. We understand these events were started when the bodies of the army was brought from Jaffna to Kanatha prison, and from there the attack on the Tamils started. On the 25th morning, we could see the whole Colombo was in fire. The whole smoke around our prison we could see. And we could see all what is going on and here. On the 27th, the attack was on us, or the youth offender section, which was also well protected. But even though Sinhalese criminals were let out to attack on us, and we were at the receiving end. And among the 9 of us, when Dr. Rajasundaram was killed, we fought for 20 minutes with the Sinhalese criminals, and we survived. We didn't allow them to let in. And finally, the army came and fired the tear gas, and they dispersed. At the same time, at the downstairs, where the 27 prisoners were kept, 18 of them were killed. And like that, 53 people were killed in the Velikada prison on that day. Till today, there was no inquiry, no justice had been done to the Tamils or to the Tamil political prisoners. And we look back, in the last 38 years, these massacres have continued, and we are without justice, without freedom. And we asked the international community to understand and bring justice and freedom to our people. I could share many things. Due to the time constraint, I will try to end here, and thank you for giving this opportunity.
We thank Mr. Anton for his account. It's just heartbreaking to hear what happened at Velikada prison in 1983. I will now pass you on to Sir Ed Davey. Sir Ed Davey is the leader of the Liberal Democrats and has been is a member of Parliament. Sir Ed Davey has been a robust proponent on working with us for the rights of Tamils in Sri Lanka and has attended the United Nations Human Rights Council with us numerous times. And we're so honoured to have Ed with us again today and for his continued support. Over to you, Ed. Thank you. Sorry, you're on mute, Ed.
Thank you, Vanakkam. It's an honour to address you all at this memorial event and to be able to join you in remembering all those Tamils who were tragically killed, tortured, forced to flee their homes 38 years ago. The atrocities which took place against Tamils during Black July were simply horrific. And now 38 years on, that legacy sadly continues, from the displacement of Tamils around the world to the continuing division sown by the Sri Lankan government and the ongoing lack of accountability and justice for all those who suffered and for all those whose human rights were breached. Liberal Democrats stand against human rights abuses everywhere. That is why we will continue to make the case for recognition of the genocidal actions against Tamils. This is why we will continue to call for all those who committed war crimes to be properly investigated and held to account for what they have done. And is why we will continue to call on the UK government to put far more pressure on the Sri Lankan government. We want to see a full commitment from the Sri Lankan government to programmes around truth and reconciliation and the implementation. We want commitment to address ongoing regional and ethnic disparity and delivering conflict-related justice. It is also right that the UK calls upon the Sri Lankan government to reform its security sector, its criminal justice system, its Terrorism Act, in line with international standards, and that must include police accountability. Now, we know the story at the UN Human Rights Council. First, the Sri Lankan government pretending it was going to meet its resolution pledges, then withdrawing. And I think that history shows we can't trust this Sri Lankan government. And while the resolution adopted at this year's UN Human Rights Council didn't go as far as I would have liked, I'm pleased that it made an agreement, international agreement, that the evidence should be brought together and should be investigated. And we need to see that happen, and we need to see that happen at pace. We need to make sure that where human rights abuses have taken place, that the UK speaks up on the international community act. And I hope that in the UK, we can ensure things like our trade policy takes account of human rights conditions. And I think, frankly, anything less would be shameful. I think we need to look at the use of Magnitsky sanctions, which have already placed sanctions on perpetrators of serious human rights violations from a number of countries, Russia and China, to name but a few. But so far, the UK government has not imposed any such sanctions against any individuals who committed atrocities in Sri Lanka, even though the United States has taken such steps. I believe, Liberal Democrats believe, that where there is evidence that any individual has been involved in war crimes or human rights abuses, Magnitsky sanctions have to be on the table. And if the Sri Lankan government does not want to engage with the processes of reconciliation and justice, then it is clearly right that independent multilateral institutions should do so. And I'm pleased that the UN Human Rights Council has made that clear. Frankly, I would like to go further. I think the UK should use its position on the UN Security Council to refer the situation to the International Criminal Court. I don't think the international community can turn a blind eye any longer to these injustices. These are injustices that didn't even start with the injustices of 38 years ago that we're remembering today. They started long before then. There has been a track record of genocidal activities by the Sri Lankan government, successive Sri Lankan governments. It led to the injustices of the Civil War. It continues with the injustices taking place today. There has to be far stronger action, whether it's by the UK government or the international community. And I think on anniversaries like we have today, it's time to renew that call and renew our commitment to that call. So my thoughts today on this important anniversary are with everybody who's been impacted or affected by it, and to remember all those who suffered because of it. Nandri Vanakam.
Nandri, thank you so much for that, Ed. I think you raised some important points from Magnitsky Act to the referral for the ICC. I think these are things that the Tamil community have been working hard for in years, and we look forward to working with you in the future. And thank you so much for attending today as well. Up next, we have Switzerland Tamil Action Group. So here with us today, we have Vidushan Yogaraja and Abrana Rasalingam. They both live in Switzerland, and their main focus in Switzerland is to conduct advocacy with politicians, civil society, including human rights defenders in Switzerland, to get accountability, justice, and legitimate rights for the Tamils in Sri Lanka. Over to you, Vidushan and Abrana.
So good evening, everybody. We will be talking about cycles of violence in Sri Lanka. The Tamil people of Sri Lanka have been subject to state-sponsored violence, discriminatory policies, and acts of genocide since independence from Britain in 1948. To this day, the Tamil people do not have many rights, including the right to mourn, freedom of speech, and living in fear under constant military presence in the Tamil north and east of the island.
Before independence, there was a struggle of nationalism against British colonialists. There were many incidents of violence clashes between Sinhalese Buddhists and Christians and Muslims as well. The Panadura debate, held in 1862, was the climax of the first phase of Buddhist revivalist movement. In 19 1903, the Catholic church Anuradhapura was burned. Anti-Muslim riots took place in 1915, where Sinhalese mobs attacked Muslim traders and shops.
Since independence from Britain in 1948, there have been more than 150 recorded massacres committed by the Sri Lankan state, Sri Lankan armed force, and Sinhalese mobs. As a result of these incidents, more than 150,000 Tamil people lost their lives. There were many anti-Tamil pogroms which occurred before Black July 1983. We will be talking about a few of these in the following slides.
The Gal Oya massacre was the first organized anti-Tamil program that happened in 1956. Local Sinhalese colonists and employees of the Gal Oya development boards seized government vehicles and weapons and killed over 115 Tamil people.
In 1961, from February to April, Tamil politicians and civilians across the north and east peacefully protested against the government's Sinhala-only policies.
Tamil people across the northeast united to peacefully protest against the government. However, they were met with violence from the state, police, and army. Many peaceful Tamil protesters suffered injuries.
The Fourth World Tamil Conference was organized by Father Thaniyagayam Alikalar, who was a professor of the Tamil language in Malaysia. Tamil delegates from all over the world, such as Tamil Nadu, Malaysia, Mauritius, and many more places, attended to this conference in Jaffna, Sri Lanka. The event took place in the evening when suddenly Sri Lankan police officers started shooting at Tamil attendees. As a result, 9 Tamil people were killed and a further 50 Tamil civilians sustained injuries.
Tamil United Liberation Front had landslidely victory and won 18 seats at the 1977 general election. This was not well received from the Sinhala polity. Violence suppressed across the island, where Sinhala mobs murdered hundreds of Tamil civilians by burning them alive, raping, killing, and looting their homes.
Jaffna Public Library was the biggest library in the whole of Asia and was subjected to arson attack which destroyed everything its one held. Over 97,000 culturally important and irreplaceable Tamil manuscripts were destroyed. For Tamils, the devastated library became a symbol of cultural genocide.
And as we heard already before, Black July occurred between the 24 and 30 July 1983. 3,000 Tamils were killed, burnt alive, and Tamil women raped and killed by Sinhalese mobs. Over 150 Tamils became displaced, and over 8 Tamil-owned business and homes were looted and burned down.
On 19 February 1985, Udumbakulam massacre occurred. The Sri Lankan army rounded up 103 Tamil people in the fields and took them to the forest nearby. There they raped and cut the breast off from the Tamil women and killed them. Others were lined up and shot dead. In total, 103 Tamil people were killed, including many Tamil children.
Here is a list of available names of the victims of Udumbakulam massacre. And here the following list shows the massacre that took place between 1984 to 1986. On 28 January 1987, Kokkaranjole massacre occurred. The Sri Lankan military began attacks on the village and continued for 3 days. More than 200 Tamils were killed.
The following list shows massacres that took place between 1990 to 1995. On 12 June 1991, the people of Kokaricole suffered through a second massacre at the hands of the Sri Lankan army. More than 220 people were killed.
On 9th of July 1995, the military ordered Tamil people to take refuge in church and temples. About 2,500 Tamil people followed the military's order, left their homes, and took refuge in St. Peter's Church in Navali. 8 rocket bombs were dropped on St. Peter's Church and its surroundings. 155 bodies of Tamil civilians were recovered, and 250 Tamil people were seriously injured.
A mass grave was found at the Germany military checkpoint. As many as 600 Tamil civilians went missing after being arrested by the military. In 1998, the Sri Lanka Human Rights Commission began inquiring into this disappearance, but no one has been found accountable.
Here, the following list shows massacres that took place between 1996 and 2000. As a result of military clashes, many Tamil people became displaced. On 19th December 2000, 9 Tamil people went back to their village of Mirusaville to collect essential items they needed for living. All 9 were arrested and were blindfolded and killed by the military.
The following list shows massacres that took place between 2005 to 2007. On 2nd January 2006, many young people, Tamil students, gathered at the Gandhi statue near the ocean in Trincomalee. Some Sri Lankan soldiers arrived in a 3-wheeler and threw a grenade at a group of young Tamil students. 5 Tamil students were killed in this massacre, which is known as the Trinco 5 massacre. Sugirtha Rajan, a journalist for the Tamil Daily newspaper, wrote a full-length investigative article about the killing of the 5 Tamil students, identifying the Sri Lankan army as a culprit. He was shot dead on 6 January 2006.
From 2008, the Sri Lankan army began their northern offensive, which ultimately ended with the most horrific period known as the Mulivaikal massacre in 2009. Here is a list of various attacks by the Sri Lankan armed force on the Tamil people from 2008 to 2009.
No-fire zone. In January 2009, the Sri Lankan government declared the first no-fire zone, and so Tamil civilians went to that area to take refuge. The no-fire zone was then deliberately targeted and bombed daily by the Sri Lankan armed forces. In April 2009, a new no-fire zone was declared. Again, the no-fire zone was deliberately targeted and bombed daily. As a result, thousands of innocent Tamil civilians were maimed and killed. Now you see here some pictures.
Even the brutal ending of the armed struggle in 2009, the cycle of violence continues. There is increase of militarization in Tamil homeland, no accountability, completely impunity, no justice for Tamil victims. Many Tamil civilians, as well Tamil and Sinhalese journalists, have been abducted in white vans and killed by the states of paramilitary groups.
So the current situation, Michelle Bachelet, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, stated in her report in February 2021 that she is believes that the Human Rights Council should urgently pay attention to these early warning signs and continue its close monitoring of an engagement on developments in Sri Lanka. She urges member states to pursue alternative international options for ensuring justice and reparations and so strengthen capacity to make progress. 12 years on since 2009, there is still the presence of the military in the north and east of the island. Military intimidation, lack of free speech, lack of freedom of press, continued imprisonment of Tamil political figures. Young Tamil men and women under the Draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act, PTA.
In January 2021, the Jaffna University Mullawaikal Memorial Monument was bulldozed by Sri Lankan security force. This shows that they are trying to hide and destroy evidence and any that atrocity committed by the Sri Lankan state against the Tamil people, even to this day. We, the Tamil youth and Diaspora, will continue to remember the victims of these atrocities, and we will continue to fight for justice. Thank you.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Vidishan and Abrona, for that detailed presentation on the cycle of violence, as it clearly shows that this is an ongoing pattern carried out by the Sri Lankan state. Up next, we have US Tamil Action Group. We have Dr. Elias Jayaraja, who's going to be speaking to us about the root causes of conflict. Dr. Elias.
You're on mute, Jayarajan. Sorry about that. Welcome to everyone. I will touch on the root causes of the conflict that led to Black July and the mayhem thereafter. I think we have also already seen several presentations touching on several aspects of it. So I will only take maybe a few examples. Thinking about the root causes of the conflict, there are historical reasons, and then there's recent history since independence. Historically speaking, I think the seeds of conflict were embedded by the colonialism that took place, as we know, since 1505, when the Portuguese came, followed by Dutch and the British. In 1833 is when the amalgamation of the individual kingdoms within the island were brought together by the British into one for their administrative purposes. And that colonial construct continued when independence was granted to Sri Lanka. And they did not reverse the merger. They allowed some type of a weak protection in the Salisbury Constitution with the so-called Section 29, giving some protection for minority rights that they could, if there was any action against the minorities, they could appeal to the Privy Council in the UK. And but since independence in 1948, Sinhalese majority government started to act on some historical grievances of the Sinhalese, both perceived and some real, over the centuries. You know, they have been apprehensive of some of the ancient military action that happened, where some Tamil kingdoms extended into the island. That was one of them. And during the colonial rule, especially during the latter British rule, how the Tamils were thought on civil service as being favored due to their education, etc., against the Sinhalese, and also some arising from their so-called Mahavamsa mindset of their urge to protect Buddhism in its pristine form in the only island where Sinhalese is spoken. All those together perhaps resulted in the first year itself in 1948 with the disenfranchisement of 1 million Tamils in the hill countries. And so the Tamil lives and their stake in the island in terms of numbers pretty much cut down substantially by that act. And of course, this was followed by 1956, the Sinhala Only Act, where the Tamils were expected to learn Sinhala and get proficiency to continue in their government positions. And then it led to the Sinhala III and the 1958 violence against the Tamils, and leading up into the ones that our youth group already talked about that happened in between in 1961, 65, etc., leading into the 70s. As a youth growing up in 1970s, I was witness to several of the things that happened during that time. I would say it started with the media voice standardization for the university admissions instituted by the government then in the early 70s that affected the Tamils seeking higher education, very drastically cutting their numbers down. For example, in the advanced level, with I got 2 A's and 1 B's, and everybody expected I was going to go into the engineering faculty, but I didn't get that admission. I was admitted to the physical science at the Jaffna University. And when I went there were several Sinhalese students who joined us in the same batch for the same course with just 3 ordinary passes. That is the extent to which the media standardization affected the Tamils, where the Tamils have to go significantly higher points and the merit basis was shelved. And this led to several student actions and agitations led by P. Satya Seelan, who happens to be viewing this too. And even for this small acts of agitations by significant issue, the Sri Lankan government reacted adversely and very negatively. In the meantime, they brought the 1972 Republican Constitution, in which the Tamils did not participate in formulating that. And the only small protection that was there under Section 29 in the Salisbury Constitution for the minorities to appeal to the Privy Council, that was done away with this, with the new Republican Constitution. And strangely, there was no response or deputation from the United Kingdom. So this is a second time that UK again failed in their duty to to do away or help in the situation that they created by the colonial acts. As we grew up in the 70s, then of course the 1974 World Research Conference is an important thing that the Tamils all over in the island were very proud of their language and very thrilled to have that opportunity to conduct that World Tamil Research Conference in Jaffna. But the government then put all kinds of obstacles for it to happen there, denied visas for several, and finally at the last minute yielded, and it happened in Jaffna. But of course, you all know on the last day how the police action ended up disrupting the crowds of nearly 200,000 that were there. That resulted in the death of 9 Tamil civilians. So I worked as a youth volunteer in the Tamil Research Conference. This taught to the youth at that time that Tamils own, their own security is under threat in the Tamil areas, and they don't have the right to even cherish their own language and have their own function. Under these things, of course, that led to the Vatukotte resolutions and the elections in 1977, where the Tamils gave mandate for a separate state, which immediately followed by an anti-Tamil violence of 1977. And the 1977 riots, in the aftermath of that, several people affected from the hill country were brought to the north and settled in the Vani area. Some people who helped are the Gandhian movements, of which Dr. Rajasundaram was one, and several others who were the political prisoners who finally got killed in the 1983 violence that Mr. Anton Phillips in Rasa talked about as an eyewitness earlier. 1979, of course, brought the so-called Prevention of Terrorism Act, and J.R. Jayawardena gave an edict to his commander Veeratunga, saying that he should eliminate all forms of terrorism before that year's December 31st of that year. And now, 42 years after, we still have Prevention of Terrorism Act in the statute books of Sri Lanka. I don't want to go into too much detail of 1983. It was described here adequately, but I consider that as a genocide on its own merits, even without going further into what followed thereafter during the 2009 genocide. As noted, no one has been punished for these grave crimes to this date. No compensation has been given. We happened to watch a documentary by Somi Dharan recently about the 83 violence, and there it is recorded a couple of months after 1983, JR meets with some Tamils in the south of the island, where his first question was, do you still want Ilam? So that is the attitude of somebody, an educated Sinhala elite to the country's problems. So when we talk about the root causes, we talked about the Sinhala misconceptions that contributed to that, and the colonial construct of a state that ended up in 1948. Sinhala is still thinking the whole island belongs to them, and their attitude of us versus them, where they don't accept plurality. And it is again reinforced by the impunity prevailing there over all these years for that, without anyone getting punished for what they act, and oftentimes they got promoted after each and every single act. Several military people got promoted, and also it is coupled with the judicial importance prevailing there, where Tamils cannot expect any justice through the local courts. From there, just moving on to thinking of solutions. How do you reverse the situation? To have a plural society in the whole island, the Sinhala perceptions should change. But when will that happen? And are the Tamils supposed to sit and wait for it to happen? This reminds me of a situation decades ago when Lech Walesa, the former president of Poland, while he was agitating through trade union action in that largely Catholic country under communist rule, he was asked, why can't you wait for the church to bring about these changes there that you are seeking? For which Lech Walesa replied, yes, you can wait, but you know, church makes mistakes and takes like 500 years to correct them or to acknowledge them. We cannot wait that long. And he continued with his trade union action, resulting in new government forming and a democratic leadership emanating from that country. So like that, we know there are Sinhalese civil societies who have the right outlook, want to have accommodation with the Tamils, but they are very few in number, and we don't, we cannot simply sit and wait for that to happen. So, what path are we left with? We obviously, it was already talked about and touched by the British MPs, Honorable Stephen Timms and Sir Red Devi adequately. That is on the accountability issues, where a substantial resolution with some teeth was brought this year in March in the Human Rights Council. So the accountability is a primary thing that we should be working towards, that can also lead to a political solution, but they don't have to be one follows the other, and we need to work for both simultaneously to happen. So to this effort, I think we should support and encourage India and the United States and any other world powers to also simultaneously lead actions toward a political solution, regardless of whatever the government sitting there in Colombo. And this parallel path in which the UN Human Rights Council and the UN and the International Criminal Court deal with the accountability, the diaspora should act with responsibility to advance both goals simultaneously through their advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Elias, for that detailed account on root causes of conflicts. Up next, we have our special guest, Mayor Patrick Brown from Canada. Mayor Patrick Brown is the current mayor of the city of Brompton. He started his political career in the Barrie City Council in the early 2000s. He is also a lawyer and has practiced law in the city of Brompton. He continues to fight for more funding for better healthcare, transit, affordable housing, and education. He has also vowed to build a monument in the city of Brompton to commemorate the lives lost in the Tamil genocide. Thank you, Mayor Patrick. Over to you.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to join this commemoration, and I do so on behalf of the residents of Brampton. Thank you to the National Council of Canadian Tamils that extended this invite to myself. And this 38th remembrance of Black July is important. As previous speakers have said, we still haven't seen the accountability and justice for the perpetrators of this genocide, this crime against humanity, and those that engaged in this conduct. Hope that we forget about it, hope that this gets swept under the carpet, and it can't. Those lives lost cannot be lost in vain. And I know there's more and more recognition around the globe of the abuses of human rights and the genocide that took place in Sri Lanka. But I believe it's the responsibility of democracies across the world to continue to speak up against the fact that this is a stain on human history, that just like we saw, whether it was in Rwanda or Nazi Germany, when there is targeted attacks against people, it goes against the love that humanity should be about. And it pains me. The more I learn, the more I read, the more I hear about the Tamil genocide. When you look back, This happened within our generation. The fact that, and you look at the acts in 2009, that is so recent. The pain, the hurt, the loss of life, the loss of loved ones is still so recent. And I've now had the opportunity to serve at 3 levels of government: in the national parliament in Canada, on the provincial level, and then on the local level. And I believe that we need to continue to speak loudly and use the platforms we have to demand accountability. And events like this are an opportunity to make sure that the story continues to be told, that the horror of Black July in 1983 and the targeted attacks against Tamils across Sri Lanka, that those abuses against humanity are shared. In the city of Brampton, we were horrified earlier this year when we heard about the monument being destroyed in Jaffna. And as a response, we committed to build our own monument in the largest park in our city, remembering the loss of life in the genocide. And I believe this is consistent with Canadian values. And I'm proud that Canada was one of the countries that boycotted the Commonwealth in Sri Lanka, and believe that all democracies around the world need to continue to put pressure on Sri Lanka to own its own history. And you look at South Africa, when apartheid came to an end in South Africa, there was stubbornness. There was countries that just wanted to go along with economic relations and trade, but it took moral clarity. It took countries like Canada that stood up and said, no, it wasn't right. Apartheid wasn't right. And I believe we have a responsibility now going into the future to say what happened in Sri Lanka with events from Black July all the way to 2009, it wasn't right. It was a stain on human history. And we need to make sure that Sri Lanka owns their own history. Because if there is not accountability and recognition and responsibility, you're never going to have true reconciliation. And so I wanted to come on this call today to let you know that you have friends in the city of Brampton that are proud and fierce advocates. And for me, it's very personal. You know, I remember in 2009 when I had a constituent when I was in the federal parliament who told me about the IDP camps in Sri Lanka. I remember her name, Ranji Sureshkumar, and she asked me for help to get a loved one out of those IDP camps. And I said, okay, I'll go and visit. And myself and another Canadian parliamentarian applied for visas to go to Sri Lanka to visit the IDP camps, and our visas were denied. Think about that, a parliamentarian having their visa denied, simply wanting to look at an IDP camp and make sure that we could extend sponsorship forms to bring those fleeing terror and horror and genocide the opportunity to come to Canada, and our visa was denied. I knew at that moment that something horrible was being covered up. And here we are 12 years later, and we continue to learn more about the gravity of that genocide. And I'll never forget that moment when Ranji Sureshkumar was in my office in tears telling me about what was happening to her family. And I will continue to be an advocate, because when I think about Ranji Sureshkumar, I think to myself, what if that was my uncle, my aunt, my sister, my brother, my mother, my child? And that's the way we have to look at it. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be allies and champions of the Tamil community, because what if that was our own brother or sister? And until this is rectified, until there's accountability, that pain will continue. So thank you for the opportunity to join you today on this commemoration of the 38th anniversary of Black July. And I stand here as a friend and an ally in the crusade to bring justice.
Thank you so much, Mayor Patrick. Thank you so much for your kind words. And I can definitely say you've touched our hearts with your account. And to actually hear that you've applied for a visa in 2009 to go to those camps, and you as a politician to have witnessed that firsthand, it's a lot. And especially after what happened at the start of this year with the monument being destroyed in the north at the university, and for you to vow to say that, we're going to hopefully get a monument in Brompton as well, that means a lot. And thank you so much for your continued support and for attending today. And we look forward to working with you. Thank you so much. Up next, we have Shivani from British Tamils Forum. Shivani Sabesan is the International Relations Deputy Coordinator for BTF. She has been advocating for peace and justice for Tamils since she was a teenager and joined BTF in 2017, and continues her advocacy work both at the United Nations Human Rights Council and within the UK government. Thank you, Shivani.
Thank you, Sarmila. Sri Lanka's continuous cycle of violence is the proof that Sri Lanka's future conflicts in Sri Lanka will escalate. But the question is, what form will it take? The Sri Lankan government has so far carried out genocidal acts, the killing of the people of the Tamil nation. From the way in which the government behaves, it is obvious that the future conflicts will carry on, eradicating all traces of Tamil national identity, rapidly increasing different types of land grabs with the intent of destroying the land contiguity of the Tamil nation, identity, culture, keeping Tamils dependent on the state apparatus such as handouts, depriving the education, infrastructure, wealth accumulation and reconstruction of the war-torn region, keeping north and east inter-district transport dependent on singular districts, and similar matters that keep Tamil nationals living as second-class citizens. As China becomes ever more influential of Sri Lanka, it further fuels Buddhization in the traditional Tamil homeland. Religious hatred against all religions that aren't Buddhist, not in particular Hindus, Christians, and Muslims, is increasing across the island. Chinese influence takes many forms in Sri Lanka, such as occupying land and sea, Colombo Port City related issues, debt crisis, security threats, freedom of navigation, abrogation of the Indo-Lanka Pact and replaced by China-Lanka Pact, leading to the possibility of the arrival of a small unit of Chinese defense personnel under the pretext of safeguarding economic interests. Sri Lanka has very much returned to the past. Abduction, tortures, and enforced disappearances are a threat Tamils face daily, living their life in fear of the Sri Lankan government, its military and police force. Despite the Sri Lankan government making many international commitments to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act, it continues to abuse its power and make arrests under these laws. As Sri Lanka is well into the process of becoming an autocratic military state that is mono-religious, monolinguistic, and mono-ethnic, it sets the precedent for future conflicts. The latest budget report released by the Sri Lankan government shows a 10% increase in the military budget, despite there being no present internal or external security threats. All these factors in a war-torn country with no justice or accountability for the victims who continue to be oppressed is a formula for future conflicts, which the Sri Lankan government is knowingly orchestrating. The following are easily identified from its actions: the militarization of civilian government function, the reversal of constitutional safeguards, the political obstruction to prevent accountability for crimes and human rights violation, the Majoritan and exclusionary rhetoric, the surveillance and obstruction of civil society and a shrinking democratic space, and new and exacerbated human rights concerns. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights is concerned that these represent important early warning indicators that require the urgent attention of the Human Rights Council. If there are no significant progress on resolving the ethnic conflict, Tamils will lose interest in working on advocacy with countries practicing liberal democracy and fighting injustice. This will be difficult for the West. Tamil identity will be lost forever. Tamils will be prepared to live with a cruel reality and get assimilated by the state. Tamil identity will be destroyed, resulting in a mono-ethnic, monolingual, and mono-religious nationality. Sri Lanka will become isolated from the rest of the world, moving away from liberal democracy and start driving towards an autocratic state. Hence, the West will lose any kind of leverage in a strategically important place in the Indian Ocean region. This could create severe destabilization for the region. And finally, China. China will become most influential factor in Sri Lanka and the region around it. Their political, diplomatic, and military support will aid Sri Lanka in disregarding the liberal views, the liberal values, and strengthen the tendency to create mono-ethnic, mono-religious states. Once Sri Lanka has become a homogenized nation, the stated position of not allowing international community into their internal matters will be further entrenched. Again, this will be a destabilizing factor in the long run. In view of the above, we call upon international community to develop an integrated, coherent strategy to this long-lasting conflict and to take coordinated action not only to protect the Tamils in Sri Lanka from genocide and annihilation, but also to strengthen its role and importance in the Indian Ocean in the best interest of working towards world peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Shivani, for that detailed presentation on future conflicts, because as we know, future conflicts are definitely going to be taking place. And with China's influence rapidly increasing in Sri Lanka, we don't really know what kind of threats await. So thank you for that. And up next, we have MP from Canada, Gary Anandasangari. Mr. Gary is a Tamil Canadian lawyer and a human rights activist. He is currently a member of the Canadian Parliament. Mr. Gary.
I'm Gary Anandasangari, Member of Parliament for Scarborough Rouge Park in Canada. And I want to first off thank the British Tamil Forum for this opportunity and for their advocacy towards justice for Tamils in the international arena. Today marks the 38th anniversary of Black July, the fateful day of July 23rd, when many Tamils in Colombo whose lives were changed forever. Armed mobs with electoral lists provided by the government at that time went door to door, knocking on Tamil households and hurting them, killing them, looting their homes and businesses. In many ways, the diaspora that we see in places like the United Kingdom and Canada is a result of Black July. It sparked a mass exodus of Tamils who yearned for a better life, for freedom, for safety and security. It also sparked the 26-year armed conflict that resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of people. The anti-Tamil program also changed the landscape of the island forever. The Tamil genocide that ensued ended in Mullawaikal in May 18th of 2009. One of the saddest parts of Black July is that no one has ever been held accountable for their actions or their failures as leaders who supported the program. Today, we see after almost 12 years of the end of the armed conflict, we see that justice has not prevailed in Sri Lanka yet. In fact, the road to justice on the island has been very weak, if non-existent. However, the international community has been quite vocal in ensuring that there is a path towards accountability on the island. The successive resolutions by the United Nations Human Rights Council, including 46-1 that was passed this March, has a roadmap that does allow for truth-seeking, for accountability to take shape on the island. I want to thank the many advocates, but also the survivors who have been very vocal in advocating for accountability to take shape. But we know that accountability alone is insufficient. We also need a long-term political settlement, a political settlement that's based on the notion of self-determination, one that allows Tamils in the North and East to be able to merge into one political entity. it also requires Tamils to have freedom over decisions that impact them, including over land, natural resources, and security. So on this Black July, let us recommit to working towards justice and accountability. And I want to thank all my colleagues from the House of Commons in the United Kingdom for their tireless work and your ongoing support and advocacy on the rights of the Tamil community on the island of Sri Lanka, but also internationally.
Thank you for Mr. Gary for sending that video across. Up next, we have Human Rights Watch. Meenakshi Gunanglia is South Asia Director at Human Rights Watch. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch in 2004, before joining Human Rights Watch in 2004, she worked as South Asia correspondent for Time magazine. She has closely followed Tamil rights issue in Sri Lanka for several decades in her work, first as a journalist and later as a human rights activist. Meenakshi from Human Rights Watch.
Anniversary of the terrible events of July 1983, when Tamil communities were targeted by mobs with the complicity of the government and security forces, is an important time to remember violence and civil war. Except in a handful of cases, there have never been credible investigations, much less justice or reparation for victims of abuses. The government of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has blocked any and all efforts at achieving justice and is responsible for harassment, threats, and discrimination against many Tamils and Muslims. Resolution 46/1, which was approved by the United Nations Human Rights Council in March 2021, is a small but important step in the right direction. It mandates the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights to collect and analyze evidence of crimes under international law that were committed in Sri Lanka in the past for possible future prosecution in courts around the world. It remains a long road ahead before justice can be achieved. That is why we are calling on governments, including the UK, to keep up the pressure using the full range of instruments at their disposal, including targeted sanctions on individuals implicated in the worst crimes. Meenakshi Ganguly, South Asia Director of the Human Rights Watch.
Thank you for Meenakshi for sending us that written statement. Up next, we have Kirupaharan, who is a General Secretary of Tamil Center for Human Rights. Kirupaharan, since 1990, has attended the United Nations Human Rights Councils and writes analytical articles on human rights and politics in English and Tamil. Mr. Kirupaharan. Mr. Kirupaharan, are you here? Just give him 30 seconds to a minute to see if he... We're just going to move on to the next speaker whilst we confirm. Up next from the Norwegian Council of Ulam Tamils, Principal Naval Engineer and Ulam political activist since 1997, Stephen Pushparaja. Mr. Stephen Pushparaja from Norwegian Council of Ulam Tamils. Apologies, we're just going to move on to the next speaker. From MTE France, spokesperson La Nation du Tamil Ulam, or Center for the Protection of Tamil Rights. Mr. Tirukoti Tirukulasingaram, sorry. MTE France. We have Mr. Kirubaharan from Tamil Center of Research, Tamil Center for Human Rights. Mr. Kirubaharan, over to you. Apologies for the delay. He should be joining us very shortly. We're going to move on to a video message until we get our speakers back online. The next message is going to be from Mayor John Tory. He's the mayor for the city of Toronto in Canada. Mayor John Terry is the current mayor for the city of Toronto. He was born and raised in Toronto and spent his career giving back to the city he loves working with. He has worked and made the city government more modern and effective to deliver better services at a more competitive price and to be more open and accountable to the public. Video message from Mayor John Tory.
Vanakkam. Hello, Mayor John Tory here, extending thanks to the National Council of Canadian Tamils for the invitation to speak in recognition of the 38th year of remembrance of Black July. Black July represents a dark chapter in the history of the Tamil people, with the events of July 23, 1983, leading to senseless violence and damaging riots sparked by anti-Tamil rhetoric that grew rampant in Sri Lanka. Black July, in fact, pushed many Tamils out of Sri Lanka in search of safety and refuge around the world. Many of those who were impacted set down roots right here in Toronto to rebuild their lives. And of course, you, the members of the Tamil community, have become pillars in our community in every single area of life without exception. And the Tamil Canadian community today plays such a vital role in the success of our city, making contributions to our city's political, business, social, and cultural fabric, just to name a few. The vibrant heritage and the beautiful traditions add to the tapestry of our city, and we're better for all of that. And so as we reflect on Black July, we're reminded of the painful and tragic past of so many in our Tamil community and people who didn't make it here. But it's crucial that we take that reflection seriously so as not to repeat history, so as that we never again allow divisiveness and polarization to reach that kind of dangerous stage. And that is why I, as mayor, along with the City Council and Toronto at large, the entire population of Toronto, stand in firm solidarity with the city's Tamil community to find the accountability and justice locally and globally in particular. That search for justice and accountability in Sri Lanka continues. The Tamil community is resilient, it's adaptable, it's strong. We must support you and condemn hatred, especially as we recognize and remember the traumatic days of Black July and those days that followed for many people seeking justice and accountability in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor John. Our next speaker is Krish Govindra from South Africa Tamil Action Group for Peace and Justice in Sri Lanka. Krish was the former state attorney and deputy chairperson of Solidarity Group for Peace and Justice in South Africa. Mr. Krish.
Sarmina, it's Craig speaking at the moment. I'm sorry to advise you that Comrade Krish has had an urgent matter to attend to, and he's asked me to read out his message for you. So if you don't mind, firstly, I'd like to say a big vanakkam to everybody and greetings from South Africa. The Solidarity Group wishes everybody on this occasion of commemorating this solemn occasion of the 1983 attacks on the Tamil population in Elam, the killings and the destruction of the property and businesses of Tamils by the racist elements of the Sinhalese population as promoted by their government on the island is a fresh reminder of the ongoing struggle for justice for all the people, especially the minorities in Sri Lanka. No amount of petitions and campaigns for justice through international agencies like the United Nations or via any right-thinking government in the world has led to a single perpetrator of gross violations of human rights, war crimes, and genocide by the Sri Lankan government, its army, clergy, and racist supporters ever being arrested anywhere in the world. 1 or 2 persons on the island were arrested and convicted of minor transgressions and received a slap on the wrist. This direct and structural violence against the Tamil and other minorities continues with impunity on the island. Where does this leave the Tamil-speaking population, representative of the minorities who are subjected to oppression daily? On the island, on the one hand, the Sri Lankan cricket team plays all over the world with impunity and lots of celebrations with no regard to Tamil lives, which matter. This cricket team must be subjected to special attention via those friendly governments which cannot do any tangible to address the ongoing violent oppression. Israel is beginning to feel the pressure, targeting sporting, cultural, academic, and other social areas of activity. Why is this not developing in relation to the cricket team of Sri Lanka? One obvious answer is the multiple divisions within the tiny Tamil diaspora, which has not been able to speak with a single voice or even 2 voices, but can afford the luxury of almost a dozen or more different formations whose strength is uniting around commemorations. This is no doubt a delight for the Sri Lankan government, which enjoys some credibility throughout the existence of internal Tamil parliament, called the TNA for short. In short, the United Nations serves the purpose, namely to record the violations of human rights and a debating forum for the academic solutions. Only the weak and undefended perpetrators are targeted and possibly arrested. The nations of the world are preoccupied with the consequences of COVID-19 pandemic, economic downturns, internal conflicts, climate change, and climate destruction as a result of the global warming caused by the richest nations. South Africa is dealing with internal issues of fighting grand-scale corruption and looting of state resources by government and the ruling party agents, resulting in abject poverty and unemployment amongst the majority Black and poor Black minorities as well. The failure to address the corruption allegations against leaders timeously has resulted in the strategic attack and attempted insurrection by the corrupt ANC gangsters against the ANC government in the past recent weeks. This is also strategically diverted by these crooked counter-revolutionaries to target the people of Indian origin, thereby exposing the hidden racism amongst handfuls of armed thugs within the Indian community, resulting in random killing of Black persons under the cover of protecting their communities and their homes. Social media is a poisoned chalice from which populations drink. South Africa is at a standstill and even moving backwards. Until this slide is reversed, Tamil question will be on the back burner, but not forgotten. One can only hope that the unity amongst the diaspora of Tamils will emerge as a miracle in order to tackle the regime in Sri Lanka. Despite the pandemic, the global climatic anger of Mother Earth, and the ongoing geopolitical chaos and corruption of world governments and leaders. Nandri. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Preggs, for stepping in. We really appreciated that. Up next, we have a video message from Congressman Brad Sherman. Congressman Sherman is a senior congressman from Southern California. He is currently a senior member of the House of Foreign Affairs Committee and leads a subcommittee on Asia. He also serves in the important financial services and science, space, and technology committees. He is also a member of the Congressional Caucus for Ethnic and Religious Freedom in Sri Lanka. He is passionate about human rights and stands up for those marginalized. He has a very inclusive and liberal focus on his legislative work. Tamils are deeply grateful to Congressman Sherman, who has highlighted their situation in Sri Lanka from the time he entered Congress. He continues to bring up the situation of the Tamil people repeatedly in Congress, and we thank him for it. Congressman Sherman.
I'm Congressman Brad Sherman from America's best named city, Sherman Oaks. And for 25 years, I've served on the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Representatives. Today, I'm joining with so many who are remembering the victims of Black July. On July 23rd, 1983, some 38 years ago, horrific violence was directed at the ethnic Tamil community in Sri Lanka. Over the course of 10 days, mobs targeted Tamil families and properties, and an estimated 3,000 people were brutally killed. Millions of dollars of property was destroyed, and decades of conflict followed. We must remember the victims of Black July, and we must remember that more must be done to protect the human rights of every person in Sri Lanka. Too many of those responsible for the unconscionable crimes and violations of human rights that occurred during the conflict in Sri Lanka have simply not been brought to justice. In May of this year, I joined with a number of my colleagues here in the United States Congress in introducing House Resolution 413, which honors the lives of those lost in the war in Sri Lanka and expresses support for justice, accountability, reconciliation, reconstruction, reparation, and reform in Sri Lanka. It has been over a decade since the war ended, and the people of Sri Lanka deserve a lasting, peaceful political solution and a prosperous future. I'm Congressman Brad Sherman.
We sincerely appreciate that video from Congressman Sherman. He has been a long-standing supporter in the States advocating for Tamils' rights. Up next, we have UK MP Frayal Clark. Frayal Clark is the Labour MP for Enfield North and has been an MP continuously since 12th of December 2019, and she currently holds the role as the opposition whip. Video message from Frayal Clark MP.
Dear all, I hope you are well, and I'm sorry that I cannot join you to mark this important anniversary. Today is a chance to come together and remember all those who died during the shameful violence of Black July 28 years ago. The violence seen during Black July and the subsequent failure on the part of the Sri Lankan government to make any condemnation or even show of sympathy to the Tamil community highlights the disdain they showed and continue to show towards the rights of Tamils. The suffering of the Tamil community in Sri Lanka today is a sharp reminder of the importance of continuing to ensure the Sri Lankan government properly respects human rights and the rule of law. I share the concerns of many that not a single Sri Lankan government minister, official, or military officer has been designated by the UK government for human rights sanctions. Evidence of human rights abuses is widely available, and the UK government should consider which senior figures in Sri Lanka warrant inclusion under the UK's global human rights sanctions regime. I remain committed to doing everything within my power to raise the plight of the Tamil community in Parliament to ensure that the horrific events of Black July are never seen again.
Thank you for Frayal Clark's message. Up next, we have Mr. Kirubaharan, who's the General Secretary of Tamil Centre for Human Rights. Since 1990, he has attended the United Nations Human Rights Councils and writes analytical articles on human rights and politics in English and Tamil. Mr. Kirubaharan.
Thank you, Shamila. Sorry about the inconvenience. There was a technical problem with my computer. Good evening, everyone. First of all, let me thank BTF and all other coordinating organizations for giving me an opportunity to speak in this event, the 38th commemoration of July 83. The anti-Tamil program of 1983, known as Black July, was part of the Sinhala Buddhist state-sponsored genocide against the Tamils in the island. Even though this was the worst anti-Tamil program in Sri Lanka, it was not the first and not the last carried out against the Tamil. The Tamils' non-violent struggle for our fundamental political rights was responded with 5 anti-Tamil programs in 56, 58, 1977, 81, and 83. On June 1981, the burning of Jaffna Public Library, which housed 95,000 volumes of all our historical books and documents, resulted in ashes overnight. The culprit of this cultural genocide were the security forces of Sri Lanka. Between 1983 and 2009 May, in other words, during the armed struggle, hundreds of massacres, killing, and rapes have taken place, eventually ending up with genocide in Mullawaikal on 19 May 2009. In fact, the genocide of the Tamils in the island of Sri Lanka started after the independence was granted by the British in 1948. The war forced on the Tamil people in the north and east and other part of the island caused tremendous damage economically, socially, and as well as politically to the Tamils. Today, nearly 1 million of Tamils from Sri Lanka have sought protection in various countries in the West and other part of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, to be frank, the international community, intergovernmental institutions, and NGOs, namely Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, International Crisis Group, International Commission of Juries, International Truth and Justice Project, and many other organizations are doing their maximum to find justice for the victims who are suffered abuse of human rights, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and other horrendous inhuman violations committed by Sri Lanka. Also, some like-minded, courageous individuals have contributed and continuing their task to find justice for the victims in Sri Lanka. Of course, the UN Human Rights Council, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bartlett, and other UN stake and mandate holders are working hard to find justice for what happened to the victim for many decades in Sri Lanka. With everyone's effort, sacrifices, and hard work, the UNHCR has passed 2 important resolutions in March 2014 and also March 2021. These resolutions on finding justice and accountability and reconciliation. India made a statement in the 46th session, said the unity and stability and territorial integrity of Sri Lanka and equality of justice, dignity for Tamils were neither or choices. For India, it is asked Sri Lanka to take the necessary steps to meet the Tamil aspiration through the process of reconciliation and full implementation of 13th Amendment. On 18/2021, European Parliament passed a resolution calling Sri Lanka to repeal the abusive and draconian PTA and also precondition for GSP review of Sri Lanka, which will take place in November 2021. And retreating the European Union strong opposition to the death penalty and various other matters in Sri Lanka. At the same time, on 28 May 2000, a resolution was introduced in the US Congress that urged the international community to advance for a protect and political rights and representation of the historical and oppressed northeastern region of Sri Lanka and work towards a permanent political solution to address the underlying issues that led to ethnic conflict. And also there are two other important things in the resolution which was placed in the US Congress. Ladies and gentlemen, however, since the end of the war in May 2009, the Sri Lankan government, which is smart enough in buying time and space, creating delaying tactics for 12 years, managed the effort to find justice by the international community. This includes the outcome of their own investigations and commitments. Rather than finding a political and amicable path on accountability and reconciliation, the Sinhala Buddhist government found the cunning and undiplomatic part of becoming a Chinese colony, accommodating China with a hidden agenda on accountability and reconciliation. Also, every government in power has busy strengthening the 4 pillars as their solution to the 30 years of ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka. The 4 pillars are Singhalization, Buddhization, colonization, and militarization of the Northeast. They strongly believe that if they can implement these 4 pillars successfully, then the question of accountability and reconciliation will meet their natural death. The people who are for peace and democracy around the world cannot be fooled and cheated by Sri Lanka. As far as accountability and reconciliation is concerned, the UNHRC resolution is the way forward. The resolution insists on the Northern Eastern Provincial Council being able to operate effectively in accordance with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of Sri Lanka. Granting GSP to Sri Lanka by European Union may strengthen Sri Lanka in ignoring any step to be taken in accountability and reconciliation. Therefore, we kindly appeal to everyone, intergovernmental institutions, NGOs, and like-minded people to speed up their action on Sri Lanka on accountability and reconciliation. Time is running up. Napoleon Bonaparte once said, "Take time to deliberate, but when the time has arrived, stop thinking and go in. We will fight until we die. Vaazhum varai poraduvom." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Kirubaharan. Up next, we have a video message from Robert Halfon. Robert Halfon is a Conservative Member of Parliament for Harlow since 2010, and we're very proud to say that he has worked with us and supported us since 2010. Video message from Robert Halfon.
The ongoing structural genocide of the Tamil people has been the result of decades of brutal state-led violence, oppressive policies, and a movement towards monotheist and mono-ethnic sentiments which have driven its root causes to the cyclical violence that we see. With the current level of non-compliance from the Sri Lankan state, it's become a serious necessity that the British government bring Sri Lanka to an acceptable path of accountability and transitional justice through the use of targeted economic sanctions conditional upon serious compliance with international humanitarian and human rights standards, as opposed to the government's declaration of denial and abstinence from its own international human rights mandate. The British government, which has championed this mandate, should begin to apply its unique Global Human Rights Sanctions Regime Act robustly on the perpetrators alleged by the United Nations Human Rights Council High Commissioner's Office investigation into Sri Lanka in 2015. This action, which has already seen targeted sanctions upon perpetrators in Egypt and Russia, must now be applied to perpetrators of serious human rights violations in Sri Lanka to bring genuine accountability and respect for human rights in Sri Lanka. The Tamils in Sri Lanka have suffered for too long. They deserve autonomy. They deserve human rights. They deserve recognition for the awful genocide against their people that took place. And they deserve justice. Justice.
Thank you, Robert. I'd like to make an announcement at this time. Currently, the UK Parliament is actually in recess. So that's why we've received a lot of video messages from our MPs. But despite that, we've had a number of MPs still coming on live to speak to us today. So we'd like to take the opportunity to thank all of the UK MPs who have attended today live or sent us a video message, as they didn't have to do that. Parliament is in recess, but they've taken the time to show their support for the Tamil community, and we really appreciate that. Our next speaker is James Murray. James Murray is the Labour MP for Ealing North and has been an MP since 2019. He currently undertakes the role of Shadow Financial Secretary. James Murray's video.
In my constituency of Ealing North and around the world, in remembering the thousands of lives lost and people displaced during Black July of 1983. On the 38th anniversary of what happened, the international community must affirm its commitment to seeking justice and make sure that atrocities like this never happen again. From James Murray MP, Opposition Whip. I stand alongside the Tamil people in my constituency of Ealing North and around the world.
We're just going to try pulling that video back up, sorry. Our next video is from Siobhan McDonough, who is an MP for Mitcham and Morden and has been an MP since 1997. Siobhan has been a long-standing supporter of the Tamil community and has attended the UNHRC sessions with us and continues to advocate for Tamil's right. And at the start of this year, she helped set up a backbench debate at Parliament on the Tamil issues. Video message from Siobhan MP.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Siobhan McDonough, and I'm proud to be a long-standing friend of the Tamil community. Whilst ongoing coronavirus concerns prevent us from meeting in person today, I am delighted to be able to send this video message of support. Today we pause in sadness to remember the horror of Black July. The world watched as 3,000 Tamils were killed, 150,000 Tamils were made homeless, and 8,000 Tamil businesses were looted and burnt down. We reflect on the years of pain that followed and the long road in search of truth, justice, and accountability. In March, I had the honour of holding a debate in the House of Commons to coincide with the United Nations Human Rights Council meeting, where a new resolution on Sri Lanka was adopted with the UK as penholder. The debate was timely, with the opportunity to press the UK government the imperativeness of finally securing progress. Since that debate, I have been asked by the Deputy High Commissioner of Sri Lanka if I will meet with them, and I have said that I will. It is a chance for me to make absolutely clear that we cannot and will not turn a blind eye. I send my best wishes to you all on the extremely sad remembrance event, and I'd like to finish this message by saying loud and clear that however long the road to reconciliation may still be, we will keep fighting for justice and human rights until they're received.
We thank Siobhan for that video and her continuous work in Parliament. Our next video is from Logan Kanabadi. Logan Kanabadi is the current Conservative Member of Parliament for Markham Thornhill. He was the first Tamil Canadian elected in North America as a city councillor. He's a passionate believer in human rights and equality. Video message from Logan Kanabadi. We're going to move on, unfortunately. Our next video is from Jamit Singh, who Jamit Singh is currently a New Democratic Party Member of Parliament for Burnby in South, as well as a leader of the New Democratic Party. He is also the first visible minority to be elected to lead a major federal political party in Canada. He is an active and engaged member of the community and continues to stand up for human rights everywhere. Video from Jamit Singh.
Welcome. I want to share my greetings on behalf of all New Democrats in the Tamil community, and also stand in solidarity with the Tamil community in remembering Black July, which marks one of the most horrendous attacks on the Tamil community. It's been referred to as a pogrom, but I believe it's very much a part of the genocide that was perpetrated against the Tamil people by the Sri Lankan government. In commemorating or remembering this horrible event where Tamils were targeted just for being Tamil and killed, we honor the memories of those lives lost, but we also commit to fighting for a future with peace and security for all Tamil people. I want you to know New Democrats will stand with you in the work to recognize the genocide and in the work to ensure that the Tamil community can live with peace and security in their land. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share some words with you. Nandri. Vanakkam. I want to
Thank you for that video, Jamit Singh. Our next video is from Sam Terry. Sam Terry is a UK Member of Parliament since 2019. He currently undertakes the role as Shadow Minister for Transport, and he has been supportive for the Tamil cause and has come to many of our events throughout the years. Sam Terry's message.
Black July is a time when everyone who is a Tamil, whether it be in Britain or in Sri Lanka, remembers the atrocities that happened during the awful civil war. Tens of thousands of people injured, hundreds murdered by their own government in a brutal war of oppression. Black July is the time in which we reflect on the situation now in Sri Lanka, the difficulties that Tamil people around the world still face, and their fight for justice and their fight for self-determination in their own homeland. We believe strongly in the Labour Party, and I believe as the MP for Ilford South, where we have a huge Tamil community, that justice needs to be done. And it's very difficult to stomach seeing people that have been main architects within the actual genocide and the murders that took place now in very senior positions in the Sri Lankan government. This is extremely troubling, and one of the reasons I've continued to press for Magnitsky sanctions to be brought against these individuals and against people in the Sri Lankan government who are guilty and internationally found to be so of these types of crimes. Because for justice to be served, for there to be peace across all of the island of Sri Lanka, justice does need to be done for the Tamil people, and the oppression needs to end. I know that even recently my constituents have been fleeing suffering and persecution simply because of their ethnic background. That is unacceptable, completely unacceptable. So I want to give my pledge of support and solidarity to the Tamil people in Sri Lanka and here in Ilford South, for myself and the whole of the Labour Party.
Thank you, Sam. Our next video message is from Erin Toole. Erin Toole is currently a Conservative Member of Parliament for Durham and also the leader of the official opposition of Canada and the leader of the Conservative Party. He had served as Canada in the Royal Canadian Air Force for 12 years before he retired and became a cooperative lawyer in the private sector. He is also a founding member of the board of directors for the Trust Patriot Love Foundation, which is a charity that serves veterans and military families across Canada. Erin Toule's video.
In July 1983, anti-Tamil pogroms in Sri Lanka killed thousands in acts of ethnic cleansing. Over 500,000 Tamils fled the island and many came to Canada as refugees. Tamil communities in Canada continue to fight and stand up for those in Sri Lanka today. Your community deeply understands our country's dedication to the protection of freedom and justice at home and abroad. We will always remain forthright in our condemnation of human rights abuses around the world and will continue to call on the Trudeau government to impose Magnitsky sanctions. Canada must be strong in holding those responsible for gross human rights violations accountable. Canada's Conservatives will continue to ask for an independent international investigation into allegations of genocide. We stand with Tamil community members in commemorating the tragic events of Black July. We encourage all Canadians to participate in this important month of remembrance. Let us honor the memory of the victims.
We will now play Logan Ganapathy's video.
Today is a day of mourning and remembrance for us as a member of the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora. It is an opportunity for a community to come together to commemorate the loss of our fellow Tamils, family members, and our friends and our loved ones. Remembering the events that began on July 23, 1983, the brutal killings went on a week, targeting unarmed, innocent Tamil civilians residing in Sinhalese territories, which include the plantation sectors of the Tamils. This killing, now known as the anti-Tamil pogrom. I have first-hand experience from the 1983 massacre. Many of our brothers and sisters who were killed were women and children from the plantation sector in central part of Sri Lanka. I was an active student, university student, and personally witnessed this event. I was privileged to receive one of the load of the last train, the refugees from Colombo to Jaffna, because they have completely cut off the train services to the north after that. After July 1983, they have now targeted Tamil living in the northern Sri Lanka, especially in Jaffna, in and around the University of Jaffna area. The randomly army is going out and shooting so many innocent Tamils in the Tinnavelis and Kanthambadam areas. It is because of this experience that Black July holds special place in my heart, and it still brings horrific memories. It is truly an honor to be standing here representing the Tamils of Ontario, Canada, as a member of Parliament for province, our strong and resilient Canadian Tamil community. Today, our thoughts and prayers are with those who lost their lives during this senseless era of violence. Thank you. Nandri.
Thank you for that message, Logan MP. So to conclude, I would like to explain possible global actions we can all take as a diaspora, regardless of which country we are currently living in, to ensure justice, equality, stability, and sustainable peace in our homeland. First, the UK and international community should apply universal jurisdiction against the perpetrators of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide committed as listed in the OISR report, which was carried out by the High Commissioner of Human Rights. Second, the UK and international community need to stop all forms of unethical trade going on between Sri Lanka and other countries. A way to do this is the Magnitsky Act, which has been touched upon by many speakers here today. But here in the UK, the Magnitsky Act is called the Global Human Rights Sanctions. And again, in the EU, it's called the Global Human Rights Sanction Act, which every country should be using to apply sanctions against perpetrators of genocide. The third aspect is strengthening the UNHRC evidence collection process and establishing international criminal justice mechanism. If anyone here has evidence that they would like to submit, please get in contact with us and we'd be happy to take this on. And finally, is the international community to arbitrate a permanent political solution based on the legitimate aspirations of the Tamils in Sri Lanka. I would like to thank everyone who has taken part in today's event and to all the volunteers for making today possible. Your commitment and hard work is greatly appreciated. As we remember the lives lost during Black July, we hope there is justice, accountability, and reconciliation for Tamils in our homeland. A future where impunity is ended in Sri Lanka and Sri Lankan perpetrators are prosecuted under international laws. Thank you. Nandri Allarikam.
Thank you, Sharmila. I was born in the month of May, the month that is remembered for the genocide, the killing of thousands in Mullawaikal in 2009. Every month of the year reminds me of massacre. A person born in the war zone would always remember a month with a memory of some massacre. Most months of the year are filled with days to remember killings that suppressed Tamils. It all started in the month of July 1983. The month that turned all the months black thereafter. The month that created memories of more massacres thereafter. The month that gave arms to many hands thereafter. The now quiet streets of Colombo, that's flocked by tourists and that's busy in the development of a massive city within. He's a silent witness to mass killings and brutal attacks on Tamils in that July.
In 1982, without conducting an election, the United National Party extended its rule for another 6 years by means of a referendum. President Jayawardene was criticized for this dictatorial act. In this context, officers under J.R. Jayawardene started propagating anti-Tamil sentiments among the Sinhalese people. They openly stated that all Tamils are tigers and they should be killed. A book was released which stirred up racial sentiments. The communalist Sinhalese, along with the Jayawardene government, planned to conduct a major communal riot against the Tamils. Full-scale war erupts. 1983, military domination of Jaffna intensified. The Liberation Tigers attacked the army. 13 soldiers were killed. Using this as a pretext, ministers of the Lankan government, Sinhala fundamentalists and Sinhala thugs got together to let loose violence against Tamils on a massive scale. July 23rd saw the beginning of the new rampage against Tamils known as Black July.
We heard a loud noise at the night, and we realized that there was a huge landmine attack. And in the morning, we were too afraid to go out and check everything. So in the morning, we woke up, and then we went to the university campus. And that was the time we realized that the military, a group of military men from Sri Lankan army, they were running about in the in the downtown and shooting people. And the news came that our friend Kala Parameswaran, he was attached to the University of Jaffna, he was killed. And my dear friend Vimala Dasan was killed in Panatharpur. In total, there were about 51 people that were killed. This was not very well known outside Jaffna at the time. And that was the kind of the revenge massacres, what we in sociology and anthropology would term as genocidal massacre, that happened on the 24th of July in Jaffna.
Tamils were burnt alive on the streets of Colombo. Houses and shops belonging to Tamils were burnt down.
மற்ற கோஷ்டிகள் கொள்ளிகள் குட்டிகள் ஜாமன்கள் கட்சிகளோடு திடீரென்று அந்த அப்ஸ்டியரோடு அதாவது வரி மேலே உடைச்சிட்டாங்க. பக்கத்தில் மாங்கன்றில் வரையும் மாமரத்தில் இருந்து கடவுளே 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 என்று பிரார்த்தனையோடு இருக்கிறோம். எல்லாம் வந்து இடிச்சு அட்டிக்கு பெற்று இது பற்ற வச்சு போட்டு நீங்கள் மட்டும்தானா? நான் மட்டும்தான். 3 பேர் உண்டார் இந்த எலெக்ஷன். எல்லாரும் ஓடிட்டாங்க. முதலே நான் வெளியில் போயிருந்தேன்னா அங்கிருந்து பார்த்தா நெற்றுப்பு பந்தங்களோட கடவுளே என்று கத்திட்டு அங்கிருந்து கீழே பாஞ்சேன். மரத்துலேருந்து கீழே பாஞ்சிட்டேன். விழுந்த உடனே அங்கே மதிலுக்கு அங்கே அரசிங்கடை வீடு, அந்த மரத்தில் இருக்கிற இடத்துலேயே அந்த 2 தமிழாக்கள் ஓடி வந்து அங்கே ஒடிக்கிட்டு நிற்கிறாங்க. அது எனக்கு பழக்கமான ஒரு ஆள். மாதம் மரத்தில் இருக்காங்க, வராங்க, கடையாளர்கள் வராங்க, கீழே ஒதுக்கி முதலால் வண்டி ஓடிவாங்க, முதலால் வண்டி ஓடியாங்கன்னு கட்டாங்க. மதத்தில் கடவுளேண்டு கட்டிட்டு வந்து மதில் ஓடி போய் பாய, மதிலுக்கு மேலே போத்தில் ஓடி இருந்தது இதில் ஓடி விட்டு அப்படி உள்ளாங்கால விழுந்தேன். திரும்பி பார்க்குறேன், பாதி வேட்டி மதிலில் தொங்கு, கண்ணாடி துண்டு கட்டது. இந்த சிங்கள கத்தோலிக்க சிங்கள வேணாண்டோ அவரை மனைவியும் ஓடி வந்து என்னை தூக்கிட்டு போய் எல்லாம் வேண்டி நான் பண்ணதாக இருந்தது அவங்ககிட்ட. நான் பண்ணிடணும் மியூசிக்.
We were taken for the mowing exercise under the escort of the prison guard, and we saw flames coming around our prison wall, and we were worried, and we were asking what's happening, what's this flame about, and then the prison guard told us that, don't you know that there is communal riots going on in Colombo, and these are the flames where shops are burnt and a lot of things are happening around today. And we were really shocked, and we thought that we were in a safe place. But on that particular day, about around 2 o'clock, about 100 to 200 singular prison inmates gathered around our cell, and all of a sudden the jail guard has given their bunch of keys to them. But they couldn't locate the exact key to open the door, and they smashed the padlock and opened the door and started breaking the prison doors. We were struggling to, actually when we broke the stool and took the arms of the stool, and myself and Sam Tilakaraja fought against them, preventing the intruders coming into the hall. It took about 15 to 20 minutes time to block them. In the meantime, Dr. Rajasundram, who was talking to the intruders, asking why you want to harm us. By the time the door is open and they pull him out and they hit on his head, and blood sprang out like anything, and he died at that spot. And at that time I thought I should die like that, because I don't want to get chopped off my head or hands. It was a quick death.
Sinhalese prisoners and prison officers attacked Tamil political prisoners being kept in the Velikara prison in Colombo. 50 prisoners were killed in the attacks. Tamil militants Kuttimani and Thangadurai were blinded as their eyeballs were dug out and crushed under the boots of Sinhala jailers. Sinhala prisoners cut open the abdomens of Tamil prisoners, pulled out their intestines and yelled in victory.
Lot of damage was done to the Sinhala film industry. Vijay studio was burnt down, part of Ceylon studios was burnt down, some good theatres were burnt down just because it was owned by Tamils. So, because in Colombo South, the best Sinhala center was Sapphire at Pamagala. Just because it was owned by a Tamil, that was burned down. So we didn't have a theatre in Colombo South for Sinhala films. I was with a film producer actor at that time, after the riots. He came and took us. Mr. Gunaratnam requested him to take as much as possible the negatives, because he says those can't be reproduced, but machines and things you can always buy. He said save as much as possible. So he tried, but just one man with a few of his laborers can't do that. But then Vijay Kumar Tunga went to the Vijay studios. He shouted at the people. He told them that they are making a mess of it, and somehow he was able to send the people away. And Alaric, Lionel, Fernando and crowd took whatever possible, and then they saved a few films, but not all. That was a big loss, not only for the Sinhala film industry, that was a big loss for the nation.
The violence continued non-stop for 4 days. At this point, Indian Premier Indira Gandhi was informed of the violence that was being meted out to Tamils all over Lanka. she reacted at once with a statement that there had been a genocide of Tamils in Lanka. The Indian External Affairs Minister Narasimha Rao was sent on a visit to Lanka. Rao landed at Colombo Kattunayake Airport and travelled by car. He saw with his own eyes the burning of Tamil shops by the Sinhalese. Rao met J.R. Jayawardene and asked, "Can you stop this violence or shall we stop it?" This was the message from Indira Gandhi to J.R. Jayawardene, conveyed by Narasimha Rao, to which J.R. Jayawardene replied, "We will do it ourselves." The violence, which had been going on non-stop for 4 days, came to a halt in a matter of hours.
கொழும்பை எடுத்துக்கொண்டாலும் சொல்லி பிரதேசம் எடுத்துக்கொண்டாலும் தமிழர்கள் யார் எங்கு இருக்கின்றார்கள் போன்ற பல விடயங்கள் இந்த தேர்தல் டாப்பை எடுத்துக்கொண்டு தேர்தல் பட்டியலை எடுத்துக்கொண்டு அதிலே உள்ள பெயர் விவரங்களை தயார் செய்து கொண்டு அந்தந்த பிரதேசங்களிலே அவர்களுடைய காடையர்கள் இவற்றை தயார் செய்து வைத்திருந்தார்கள் என்பது எல்லோருக்கும் தெரியும்.
Black July left more than 3,000 Tamils killed, more than 10,000 shops burnt. Nearly 1 lakh Tamils displaced in the capital city of Colombo and the south. Most of the displaced Tamils had to be shipped to the north and east, the only place where they could be safe.
இந்த இனக்கலவரத்தில் பாதிக்கப்பட்ட ஒரு பிரதேசமான ரத்னபுர பகுதியில் உள்ள ஒரு தோட்டத்துக்கு நீலகண்டை என்று நினைக்கின்றேன். அந்த தோட்டத்துக்கு அப்போது இருந்த ஜனாதிபதி J.R. Jayawardene சென்றிருந்தார். அந்த தோட்டம் பாதிக்கப்பட்ட தோட்டம். சென்றிருந்த பொழுது அங்கே அந்த மக்களை பற்றி கேட்ட ஒரு கேள்வி, இது தொலைக்காட்சியிலே காண்பிக்கப்பட்டது, உங்களுக்கு ஈழம் இன்னும் வேண்டுமா என்று. என்ன குறிப்பிட என்றால், உனக்கு ஈழம் தமிழர் உரிமையை கோருவதாக இருந்தால் இதுதான் உனக்கு கிடைக்கின்ற பதில் என்பதை சொல்லாமல் சொன்ன ஒரு நிலையாகத்தான், அந்த மனநிலையாகத்தான் நான் இதை கருக்கின்றேன். அதே போல 58, 77ஆம் ஆண்டு கலவரம், 81ஆம் ஆண்டு கலவரம், 83ஆம் கலவரத்தை ஆய்வு செய்தவென்ற அடிப்படையிலே ஒரு முக்கியமான ஒரு கருத்தை கூற வேண்டும். பதவியில் உள்ள அரசாங்கத்தின் துணையும் அந்த அரசாங்கத்தின் மூலமாக அந்த இராணுவத்தின் காவல்துறையின் துணையும் இல்லாமல் இந்த அளவுக்கு பாரிய கலவரம் அகிலங்க ரீதியாக ஏற்பட முடியாது என்பதையும் இங்கே நாங்கள் ஆய்வு ரீதியாக உணர்ந்து கொண்ட உண்மை.
As a small boy, I remember listening to the story of my grandfather, a teacher in the 1950s in a single school in southern Sri Lanka. My mother spent her childhood there, studying in the same school. Things gradually changed. Discrimination and attacks in the next decades culminated in July 1983. The deadliest of all the attacks on Tamils till then. Sri Lanka was divided. For a boy born in Coimbatore, the northern tip of Sri Lanka, the south seemed like a distant land. Like a land that was thousands of kilometers away. July 1983, the month that altered every single thing. The starting point of decades of conflict, a genocide, and a never attained reconciliation.
Apologies. We have two last videos left. One's from an MP and then just a young activist from France. Really apologies that we've overrun our time, but just the last two videos left.
Remembrance of the horrific events of Black July in Sri Lanka in 1983. And I'd like to send my very best wishes to all Tamils, and particularly to those in my constituency who've been affected by this tragedy. After Black July and 26 years of civil war, the wounds from that conflict are still incredibly fresh in people's minds. Even so, remembrance is vitally important to the cause of peace. We must remember to keep the memory of loved ones alive, but also so that history may never be allowed to repeat itself. So I'd like to express my deepest condolences to those who've lost loved ones during those terrible years for Sri Lanka, during the Black July and enduring conflict. The UK government has a close relationship with Sri Lanka and has always offered support for reconciliation and accountability, and we must all look ahead towards a lasting peace. And we must all commit to engaging with people from all backgrounds to seek a better, more prosperous and peaceful world.
That was a video message from Grant Shapps MP. And our final video is from a young activist in France.
Sorry, Sharmila. Sorry, Sharmila, he's from Canada.
Sorry, a video, young activist from Canada.
July, commonly referred to as Black July, is a month of remembrance for Tamils across the globe. 38 years ago, in 1983, the Sri Lankan state sponsored and organized a week of violent riots against the Tamil people. Thousands of Tamil homes and businesses were burnt to the ground. More than 3,000 Tamils were killed and over 150,000 Tamils became displaced. The anti-Tamil pogroms of 1983 caused the mass exodus of Tamils and contributed to the beginnings of the largest diaspora of Tamils outside the state of Sri Lanka. In 1983, Canada welcomed over 1,800 Tamils to seek refuge and begin a new chapter in their lives. Today, over 350,000 Tamils call Ontario home. Ontario has the highest concentration of Tamils living in Canada. I'm proud to represent Scarborough Rouge Park, home to the largest Tamil community in Ontario, and I stand with my constituents and the Tamil community as we mourn the loss of our loved ones. More than ever, this year with the passing of Bill 104, the Tamil people can share the stories of the genocide, speak about the trauma, and come together to remember their loved ones in a safe environment. I thank the Ontario government for recognizing the pain and trauma suffered by the Tamil community and passing Bill 104, Tamil Genocide Education Week, this year. We remember Black July 1983.
Thank you so much for everyone. That concludes all of our speeches and speakers for today. Thank you for everyone for staying on a little past our scheduled end time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Nandri.
Nandri. Thank you.
Nandri, Ma.
Thank you for the team.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharmila. Good.